So let me tell you what I want to talk about. Let's suppose you read a work of fiction. Then in some undeniable sense, there's a relationship between the self that reads the fiction and the objects of the fiction. Okay? This is not a high-powered theoretical claim. This is just a sort of common sense claim. So there's a relationship between the subject and the objects of the fiction. Okay, now the most obvious thing about the objects of the fiction is that at least it would seem some of them don't exist. So Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. In Puccini's opera, Butterfly does not exist. So at least prima facie, many objects of fiction do not exist. Yet many people, especially in the 20th century, many Anglo philosophers in the 20th century, have thought this view is crazy, to say that something doesn't exist. We'll come to why in a minute. So the object pole is problematic. What about the subject pole? Well, whatever you say about the object pole, you, the subject, seem to exist. But that's not been everybody's view. So, for example, most Buddhist philosophers think that the self does not exist. Okay, if some of the objects of fiction don't exist, maybe the self that appreciates the fiction doesn't exist either. We'll look at that question too. So what this talk is about is the relationship between the objects of fiction and the self that appreciates the fiction. So the talk has two parts. First of all, I'll talk about fictional objects. And secondly, I'll talk about fictional subjects. And then those are reasonably long sections. The last section is fairly short. We'll put those two things together and I'll spell out the bottom line of the talk. Okay, so that's where we're going. So first of all, fictional objects. Now, let me start by getting one thing straight away. Some names which occur in works of fiction, if they refer to anything, refer to non-existent objects, or at least it would appear so. So Holmes in the Conan Doyle novels, Butterfly or Cho-Cho-San in the Puccini opera. But many names that occur in fiction, in works of fiction, do refer to things that actually exist. So, for example, Holmes lives in Baker Street, Butterfly lived in Nagasaki. And Baker Street and Nagasaki are real places. You may have been to them, okay? So some names that occur in a work of fiction actually refer to real things, things that do exist. Now, some people have doubted this. They think that when a name like Baker Street occurs in Conan Doyle's fictions, the name refers not to the real Baker Street, but to some ersatz, some doppelganger of Baker Street. Now, this is not right. Look, here's an argument that's often given for why Conan Doyle's Baker Street can't be the real Baker Street. Because Sherlock Holmes lived in Baker Street. And no Sherlock Holmes lived in Baker Street. Now, that's certainly true. There was never a Sherlock Holmes in Baker Street. But if Sherlock Holmes really lived in Baker Street, then it seems that we have a contradiction here. So if that's right, then these can't be about the same Baker Street. They must be about different Baker Streets. Okay. Now, this is an argument that's often used, and it's wrong. Okay. It's wrong because Sherlock Holmes lived in Baker Street is not true. Okay. What is true is, in Doyle's stories, Sherlock Holmes lived in Baker Street. It must be like that, because otherwise you could not say there is a place in London such that in Doyle's stories Holmes lived there, but no such detective actually lived in it. Okay? Same there, same it in both places. The fact that you can say this and say this truly shows you that the Baker Street in both of these things is one and the same. And it's also important that these claims we make about Sherlock Holmes are not literally true. What is literally true is what you get when you prefix the sentence with this operator in Doyle's stories or in Madame Butterfly or generally in a work of fiction, so-and-so. All right? Because remember when Doyle wrote the Holmes novels, or Puccini wrote Madame Butterfly, he wasn't using the word with a different meaning. He was using a word with exactly the same meaning that you or I use. He didn't change the meaning, so he didn't change the referent either. So Puccini is talking about the same Nagasaki that was incinerated by the Americans in 1945. He's just saying things about it which are not literally true, but they're true in his opera. Okay, why? Well, look, there's a story called Sylvan's Box. It's about an old friend of mine, Richard Sylvan, who died some 20 years ago now, one of the great Australian philosophers. It's a story. Many of the things in the story are actually true. For example, that Sylvan lived at a farmhouse outside Canberra. But it's a story. Things happen in the story which are not true. In fact, some of them are not possible. But the story is about Richard Sylvan. How do I know? Well, because I wrote the story and I was referring to Richard. Okay? So when names like Richard Sylvan occur in a work of fiction, they can refer to the actual person, Richard Sylvan. If you have any further doubts, just think of this. If names like Baker Street and Nagasaki change their referent, then you better hold it that things, words, and other words change their reference too. Is happy. Okay, this is crazy. If those words change their meaning, then you wouldn't understand the story. Okay, so words do not change their meaning. A fortiori, they do not change their denotation in words in works of fiction. So, in works of fiction, some names refer to actual objects, and some names don't. Okay. So here's a piece of terminology. If a name occurs in a work of fiction, I'll call it a fictional name. And if a fictional name doesn't refer to an existent object, I'll call it purely fictional. So what we're concerned with is the behavior of purely fictional names. Now, we want to investigate how they behave. Well, look, a purely fictional name either refers or it doesn't. And if it refers to something that either exists or doesn't. So we have three possibilities. The first is that it doesn't refer. The second is that it refers to something existent. The third is that it refers to something non-existent. Now, I'm going to consider those three possibilities. And spoiler alert, I'm going to argue for the last of these, that the name refers to things which don't exist. Okay, so let's consider the first possibility, namely that names in fiction, purely fictional names, do not refer to anything. If you think that's right, you have a real problem, because we make lots of true claims which use names which are purely fictional. So this might be the first example that occurs to you. Holmes lived in Baker Street. That's not true. I've explained that. So I'm not talking about this. Holmes doesn't exist. I'm not talking about that either, because there's a way you can do your logic. It's called free logic, in such a way that if this name does not denote, then Holmes exists is false, so its negation is true. So these are sometimes called negative existentials. You can handle negative existentials without assuming that the name refers. Okay, so I'm not talking about these. What am I talking about? Well, things like in Doyle's stories, Holmes lived in Baker Street. That's true. In Greek myths, Zeus lived on Mount Olympus. That's true. How do you account for the truth of these things if these names do not refer to anything? Okay, so there's a well-known problem here about how you understand truth in fiction. So you can understand by that things like this. Perhaps the most popular account is David Lewis's, who said that what makes it the case that in Doyle's stories, Holmes lived in Baker Street? Well, that's true because in those worlds which realise the Doyle stories, it's true that Holmes lived in Baker Street. And Holmes actually refers to an object that exists in those worlds. It doesn't exist in this world, but exists in those worlds. Well, think about it. If that's your line, then the name Holmes refers to a non-existent object. It exists in other worlds, it doesn't exist in this world. So this is not a case of the name not referring. Okay, well, okay, there's a lot to be said about truth. That's not the only example, because we make lots of true statements about using purely fictional names which don't use this operator in Doyle's stories and Greek mythology, etc. So here's a bunch. Holmes is a purely fictional detective. Holmes was smarter than Inspector Clouseau. Inspector Clouseau is kind of idiot of a policeman that occurs in the Pink Panther films. These are very old now, but okay, they're quite funny. Okay, so Holmes is really smart. Inspector Clouseau is an idiot. Okay, all right. So Holmes is smarter than Inspector Clouseau. The Homeric Greeks worship Zeus. Okay, so all of these things are true. Now, I mean, how do you normally account for the truth of a subject-predicate sentence or an atomic sentence? Well, a subject-predicate sentence is true just if the subject, the grammatical subject, refers to an object, the predicate refers to a property, and the object actually has that property. Okay? If you think that these are true, and if you think that the names Holmes and Zeus don't refer to anything, you cannot do this. Okay? So these cannot mean what they say, literally. Okay, now, everything I'm talking about has a big literature. And what many philosophers will try to do at this point is say, well, you know, you've got to paraphrase these away. They don't really mean what they say, they mean something else. So there might be a bunch of ways in which you can try to paraphrase these claims. I'm not going to consider any examples because there isn't any time. Let me just put it like this. Resorting to paraphrase is always a strategy that you have to use when the obvious things don't work. Sometimes you have to, but it's better not to if you don't have to. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the first case, namely that purely fictional names do not refer. So let's move to the second possibility. This is the possibility that purely fictional names do refer, but they refer to something existent. Okay, which sounds a bit strange, but some people have suggested this, like Saul Kripke, Amy Thomason. Okay, so if purely fictional names refer to something that exists, what sorts of things do they refer to? Well, there are two plausible candidates. One is mental representations and one is abstract objects. So in the Locke lectures, for example, Saul Kripke suggests that purely fictional names may refer to abstract objects. They're abstract objects that can be brought into existence by a narrator or an author, but they're abstract objects. The other possibility, which is perhaps the first one that would occur to you, is that purely fictional names refer to mental representations. Now, I'm only going to talk about one of these because you'll see that there are real problems. I'm not going to talk about the other because exactly the same problems arise. So once you've seen the problems with this guy, then you can extrapolate and you can figure out what the problems for the other account is. So let's consider the possibility that purely non-existent names refer to mental representations. Okay, now there's an obvious problem with this straight away. So suppose that the name Holmes refers to a mental representation. Okay? Holmes is smarter than any actual detective. Let's suppose that's true. Okay? That's a category mistake. Mental representations are not the kinds of things that can be smarter. Okay? People are smarter than other people. So there's immediately a problem with this because you've got a bunch of category mistakes in the true things that we say. Okay, next problem. No one really thinks that Sherlock Holmes exists. Okay? If you do, you've mistaken a work of fiction for a work of fact. So if Holmes refers to an existent mental representation, Holmes does exist. Okay, so when you say Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, you cannot mean it doesn't exist. You've got to mean something else. Well, maybe exists outside the mind. So when I say Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, because I'm referring to a mental representation, what I mean is that Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist outside the mind. Sherlock Holmes exists merely in my mind. Okay, but that doesn't seem to work either. Look, Plato existed, but Zeus does not. That's true. So this is a contrast. And what it is that I'm saying of Plato, I'm denying of Zeus. So in a bit of logical notation, there's some property such that Plato has it and Zeus doesn't. So when I say that Zeus doesn't exist, I mean doesn't exist in the same way that Plato did exist. I don't mean didn't exist outside the mind. Okay, one more argument. Let's suppose I write a work of fiction, and in it, I tell a story about some mental state. I then wonder whether that mental state actually exists. So let's call this mental state S, okay? So I wonder whether S exists. And then I do my research into the psychological literature, and I find that there's no such thing as S. S doesn't exist. So the word S refers to what? A mental representation. And I've just discovered that the mental representation doesn't exist, i.e. it doesn't exist outside the mind. But I never thought it did, okay? And we were talking about a mental state. I never thought that it existed outside the mind, okay? So this is crazy. Okay, so those are objections to the assumption that purely fictional names refer to mental representations. Once you've seen the arguments, you can sort of tweak them to get exactly the same arguments against the view that purely fictional names refer to abstract objects. So I won't go through that. So here's another piece of terminology. I'm going to call an object fictional if it occurs in a work of fiction. So before we were talking about names, right? Now I'm talking about objects. So an object is fictional if it occurs in a work of fiction, and a fictional object is purely fictional if it doesn't exist. So I told you there were three possibilities. Either purely fictional names do not refer, or they refer to things that exist, or they refer to things that don't exist. So I'm going to consider now that third possibility, and I'm going to call an object purely fictional if it occurs in a work of fiction and it doesn't exist. Now, what we've seen is that the first two possibilities, namely that a purely fictional name doesn't refer or it refers to something existent, are fraught with problems, okay? So why would you buy into those if you can do something much more sensible? And the sensible thing is to suppose that these names they just refer to non-existent things. Then you can say everything you want to about them. You can say, for example, that Holmes, or let's say Zeus lived on Mount Olympus in the Greek myths, because Zeus refers to a particular non-existent object, and in the myths, well, that's where that non-existent. You can say that Zeus does not exist. Existence is a perfectly ordinary property, and Zeus does not have it. All right, so you can do just the common sense things. So why not do that? I think the philosophy of language in the 20th century, maybe not to other people. However, the story involves this guy, Willard van Ormond Quine. And Quine published a paper in 1948 on what there is. And he trashed the idea of non-existent objects. Okay? The paper is full of rhetoric rather than argument. But he argued that it was crazy to suppose there are non-existent objects. And I think that view is starting to disappear, but it's still very common. If you self. So, why did Quine say this? Well, if you read the paper, Quine's main argument is an argument by exclusion. So he says, well, look, how do you express existence? You can't use it with names because you can get rid of those with Russell's theory of definite descriptions. You can't express existence with a predicate because predicates don't refer. What's left? Quantifiers. Okay? So when you say some, what you mean is some existent. That's all you've got left. Okay? Now, this is crazy. Okay? Look, some things don't exist, like Father Christmas used butterfly. This is a perfectly ordinary sentence of English. Translated to Italian, it's perfectly ordinary Italian sentence, and it's true. Okay? Or, I wanted to buy you something for Christmas, but I found that it doesn't exist. Maybe Sherlock Holmes's magnifying glass. Okay. If some meant some existent, these would be contradictory. Patently, they're not. So, okay, what's wrong with Quine's argument? Well, as I said, it's an argument by exhaustion. Can't be. It's a quantifier, some. Now, the most obvious thing, if you think about it, is that Quine does not consider the most natural way of saying that something exists, namely, to use the monadic predicate exists. Right? So when I say Nagasaki exists and Lilliput, a place in Gulliver's Travels, doesn't exist, then I'm referring to those places and applying the monadic predicate of existence. So why doesn't Quine consider this possibility, which is the obvious one? Well, I think probably this is the influence of Russell. So in 1918, Russell published his lectures on logical atomism. And what he argues in those lectures is that exist is not a monadic predicate. Rather, exist is a second order predicate. You can only apply it to another predicate, like cat, okay? To say that cats exist is to say that some things are cats. So if it's a predicate of predicates, it makes no sense to apply it to proper names. That's Russell's argument. Okay, this view is also crazy. Look, I used to believe that Holmes exists when I was a kid, and then I learnt that he doesn't. Now, what I believed and what I learnt, those were meaningless? Hardly. I mean, they're substantive facts. All right. So Russell, I mean, has his reasons, or at least he has his arguments. And in the lectures on logical atomism, Russell has a whole bank of arguments as to why existence is a second-order predicate. And they are absolutely frightful. Okay? Go read it. You'll see what I mean. Claim to make, and I'm not going to defend it here unless you... In the book that Alberto referred to, Towards Non-Being, there is an analysis of Russell's arguments, and they really are terrible arguments. Okay. Okay, last thing on existence. Sometimes the view that existence is not a predicate is sheeted back to Kant in his remarks on the ontological argument in the first critique. This is a misreading of Kant. Kant does not say that existence is not a predicate. Existence is a perfectly meaningful monadic predicate for Kant. It has to be, because it's one of his categories, namely the category of reality. What Kant actually says, and you can go away and read it, is that existence is not a determining predicate. Bestimmung. So it's a perfectly fine predicate. It's not determining. And what he means by that is that to say that something is a cat is exactly the same as to say it's an existing cat. Okay? So existence adds nothing new. That's what he means. But it's a perfectly legitimate predicate. Now, whether or not existence is merely a determining predicate, well, that's another matter, but we don't need to go into that. Let me just say that existence is a perfectly meaningful monadic predicate, and you can use it to show that let's have a quick look at the properties of non-existent objects. So the sorts of properties that non-existent objects have, well, there can be status properties like this. Holmes is a possible object. Sylvan's box is an impossible object. Sylvan's box is an object from the story. Intentional properties, such as Zeus was worshipped by the Greeks, or little Johnny, kid next door to me, fears Gollum. But the ones that really interest us are things like this today. Holmes lived in Baker Street. That's not true. I told you that. Okay. But in Doyle's stories, Holmes lived in Baker Street. That's a property of Holmes. Not living in Baker Street, but living in Baker Street in Doyle's stories. Similarly, in Sylvan's box, Priest finds an empty box that has something in it. Okay? It's not actually true that Priest found a box that was empty and had something in it, but it's true of the empty box has something in it, that Priest found it in Sylvan's story. Okay. So, a very important species of properties of non-existent objects is precisely the ones they have in the work of fiction. Okay. So I'm going to come back to that later. All right. So much for the first part of this talk. What I've told you is that purely fictional names do exactly what naively you think they do. They refer to non-existent objects. Existence is a perfectly ordinary monadic predicate, and the purely fictional objects may or may not have the properties that they're said to have, but they certainly have the properties in the work of fiction. Okay, so let's turn to the second part of the talk. This is about not the object of the fiction, but the self that appreciates the work of fiction. So, let me clarify one thing to start with. A person is a biological entity. You and I are people. Okay? A self, in the sense that I'm going to use the word, is a part of the person which exists while the person exists, is constant, and defines the person as that person. That's what I mean by a self. Okay. So yourself is your, if you like, your essential you. And what I'm going to argue in this part of the talk is the self does not exist. Okay. Now, it certainly appears that it does. We have a sense of self. Okay? So we certainly seem to have a sense of something. So when you wake up in the morning, almost a little voice comes on in the back of your mind saying, "Hello, back again, right? It's me." Okay? This is a sense of self. Or if you want to put it in Teutonic terms, you can do it like Kant. Okay? Every thought is accompanied by an I think, ich denke, okay, which provides the synthetic unity of a priori unity of experience. Okay. In other words, you know, it's the self which kind of binds all. Okay. So we certainly have a sense of self. But do we have a self? Well, we know the brain plays tricks. Okay. So there's the blind spot phenomenon. You're probably familiar with this. So at the back of your eyeball, there's a place where the optic nerve joins the retina. And where that happens, there are no rods, no cones, no nerve cells which register the light falling on them. So if light falls on the blind spot, you can't actually see it. Now, if you sort of work very hard, you can actually manipulate yourself into seeing the blind spot, of not seeing the blind spot, I suppose. But we don't normally see the blind spot. Why not? It's because the brain is very clever, and the brain fills in gaps. So the brain says, oh, I can't really see what's there, but it looks as though it's going to be this, so it must be that. And that's what you see. Okay? The brain's really good at filling in gaps. Here's another example. It's called the fire phenomenon. You may not have heard of this before, but it's what you use to make movie films. Okay? Here's a very simple example. Sometimes you see some neon lights, maybe at a cinema or at a restaurant. And in fact, there's what there is a sequence of bulbs, globes. Okay? And what they do is they flash. Each one flashes, but they're sequenced. So this one flashes. One flashes. Then very soon afterwards, this one flashes. If you look at this, what you will see is something moving. I'm sure. But what's happening is that that's what I'm going to see. Is very good at filling in gaps. You are aware. So it's not an argument, it's just a question. Okay. So the thought is this: maybe, sure, you have a sense of self, but the self of which you have. Now, this view may sound rather strange for the 20th century, but in fact it's a very standard view in Buddhist philosophy. So Buddhism arises in the 5th century BCE, and it makes two major breaks with the general Indian culture of the time, Hinduism. The first, that in Buddhism there is no God, in Hinduism there is. The second is that in Buddhism there is no self, in Hinduism there is. So the Buddhists believe that there is no self. And the Buddhist philosophers were very smart. They gave a number of arguments for this. So let me see. What reasons might you have for supposing there's a self? Well, reasons for the existence of something can be of two kinds. Observational, I can see it, or inferential, I can infer it. Okay? So some things I know to exist because I can see them, for example, you. Some things I can't see, but I infer that they exist because that provides a good explanation of the things that I do see, like quarks, like black holes, like dark matter. So if there's a good reason for supposing that the self exists, it's got to be one or other of those. And the Buddhists had argument against both of these possibilities. Perhaps the most extended discussion is by a Buddhist philosopher called Vasubandhu in about the 4th century. I'm going to update it a bit just to make it a bit more intelligible. So, two possibilities, observation, inference. Let's start with observation. Can you observe yourself by introspection? Okay? And the answer was already given to that by the 18th century philosopher David Hume. Sometimes it's said that Hume has a very similar view of the self than Buddhists, which I think is probably true, although the Buddhists had it 2,000 years before. So this is David Hume. There are some philosophers who imagine that we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call our self, that we feel its existence and its continuance in existence, and we are certain beyond the evidence of demonstration both of its perfect identity and its simplicity. The strongest sensation, the most violent passions, say they, instead of distracting us from this view, only fix it the more intensely and make us consider their influence on self either by their pain or their pleasure. But, for my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. If anyone, upon serious and unprejudiced reflection, thinks that he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can no longer reason with him. All I can allow him is that he may be in the right as well as I, and that we are essentially different in this particular. He may perhaps perceive something simple and continued, which he calls himself, though I'm certain there is no such principle in me. But setting aside some metaphysician of this kind, okay, Hume's not serious. He doesn't really think there are other people which perceive themselves. This is just Humean irony, right? Setting aside some metaphysician of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind, that's all of us really, that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. So these are like the lights in the fire phenomenon. Okay, well, what Hume is pointing out is that you cannot perceive yourself. Hume is an empiricist, and he thinks that that gives you reason to suppose the self doesn't exist. But that was the 18th century. We know better now, because there's the other possibility, namely that we can infer a self, even though we can't see it. So, if you can infer a self, from what? Okay, well, we're postulating something, right, like dark matter or strings in string theory. And when we postulate things, what gives us reason to believe they exist is precisely that they serve some explanatory function. They can explain something that we can't otherwise explain. So the next question is, what is it that the self is supposed to explain, that you can't explain without postulating the self? Well, I guess there could be a number of answers to this question, but as Kant said, it's the self that holds all your perceptions together and provides their unity, the a priori synthetic unity of our perception. So in other words, look, some mental states hang together, like mine, okay, like yours, but some mental states, like yours and mine, don't hang together. So there's something which holds my mental states together, which doesn't hold yours and mine together. What can that be? Okay? And the thought is, well, it's the self. The self is kind of what all the mental states kind of fix to and join them together. Now, exactly how the self does that is not entirely obvious, Kant notwithstanding. But the question is, can you explain the unity of thoughts or experiences without the self? And the answer is, yes, you can. And this is pointed out by Vasubandhu. Look, the unity of our experiences is both synchronic and diachronic, okay? And diachronic falls into past orientated and future orientated. So let's consider these two things. So synchronic at the same time. So I'm walking down the street and I see a motorbike go past, and I hear a motorbike go past. So I have a visual experience and an auditory experience. But these hang together. My phenomenological experience is just of the one thing. Okay. In a way that, for example, if I'm walking down the street with Alberto and I see it and he hears it, okay, but I don't hear it and he doesn't see it, then these don't hang together. There's something about the way my auditory experience and my visual experience hang together. What is it? Well, you know, we know the answer to that from modern theories of the brain. When I see the motorbike, then the information is encoded in the part of my brain about vision, the visual cortex. When I hear the motorbike, the information is encoded in another cortex, the auditory cortex. And those two cortices communicate with each other to produce a multisensory integrated apperception. Okay? This is what cognitive scientists will tell you. Now, please. So you can explain the integration simply in terms of the causal functioning of your brain. All right, okay, diachronic. So this is over unity over time. So this can be past-oriented or future-oriented. Past-oriented. Yesterday I saw the motorbike. Today I remember the motorbike. Okay? Obviously there's a connection because there's no connection, for example, between Alberto seeing the motorbike yesterday and my remembering it today. Okay? There is a connection between my seeing the motorbike yesterday and my remembering it today. But again, there's a perfectly good neurological explanation of this. When I saw the motorbike, the information was coded in my brain in memory, namely the limbic system. And today, I can reactivate that information by stimulating the limbic system. Now, okay, so the integration is explained by the neural workings of my brain. Okay, obviously there's no similar integration between your seeing the motorbike yesterday and my remembering it today. Okay, future-oriented. So tonight I go to the restaurant and I have a drink, and I enjoy the drink, so I have another drink, and then I have another drink. And tomorrow I wake up with a hangover and a headache and so on. Now, there's an obvious connection between my pain tomorrow and my desire to drink tonight, in a way that there's no connection between your desire to drink tonight and any hangover that I might have tomorrow. Okay, Well, why so? Well, you know, the answer is obvious. Okay? When I overdrink tonight, I drink too much alcohol poisoning. The alcohol is broken down in my liver to produce byproducts, which are kind of poisonous. And the body registers this by the headache and maybe the nausea of the hangover tomorrow. So again, the connection between my actions today and the consequences tomorrow are explained precisely by the neurological connections in my brain. So,
sure, there is a unity that ties my experiences together in a way that doesn't tie my experiences and your experiences together, but you do not need a self to explain that. It's explained in purely causal terms. Okay. Well, if that's the best you can do by an argument for postulating a self to have some explanatory function, okay, stuff doesn't work. So if that's all right, then we have no good reason for believing there is a self, and so by Occam's razor, which Occam never said, there's no reason to believe it exists. You shouldn't believe that you have a self. Okay, so that's the end of the second part of the talk. So the last part is reasonably short. It's just a matter of putting the pieces together. So this is when we talk about fictions and non-fictions. What have I been saying about the self? Well, we have a sense of self, okay? But there's no self of which we have a sense. The self is an illusion. It's like, you know, the circle of moving things you see in the fire phenomenon. It doesn't exist. It's just an illusion. In the same way, when you have a sense of self, that's an illusion. Now, illusions can be very useful. So, for example, when I look in a mirror, I see something that's behind me in front of me. That's an illusion. It's not really in front of me, but it's very useful. It allows me to see what's behind me without turning my head. So illusions can be very useful. And it may well be that the illusion self is very useful for evolutionary reasons. It may well be that creatures with a sense of self are much more successful in surviving long enough to pass on their genes. Okay, that's just a conjecture. But whether that's right or not, the self is an illusion. Of course, it can be a very persistent illusion. The fact that you know something is an illusion doesn't mean that you cease to see it. So there's an illusion. I forget whose illusion this is, but what you have is a bunch of black squares and a white grid. If you look at this, you won't see this now because this is a crappy diagram, right? But if you actually see a diagram that's like that, what you actually see is black dots there and there and there. Okay, this is an illusion.
And you know it's an illusion because you know that the spots really aren't there. But in fact, that you see this is a function of a perfectly normally operating brain. It's an illusion, but you can't help seeing the damn things. So the fact that something is an illusion then it doesn't mean that you won't have the experience of it. And in the same way, it's very, very hard to get rid of the experience of a self, even if you know it is. So Buddhists have this kind of regime of practices which helps you to sort of stop having the experience of self. We won't go into that. But the self, if that's right, is a very persistent illusion. Now, that does not show that the self is not an object. Because after all, when you have an experience of the self, that's a phenomenological acquaintance with something, just as when I'm thinking of Sherlock Holmes, I have this phenomenological acquaintance with something. It's just that that something does not exist. Okay, so when you have this experience of self, you have an experience of something which does not exist. So the self is this object which you can have a phenomenological acquaintance with, just as you can have a phenomenological acquaintance with Sherlock Holmes. There are a number of contemporary cognitive scientists who have exactly this view. So perhaps one of the most influential cognitive scientists of the last 30 or 40 years is Dennett. Okay. He has a number of books on consciousness, and this is a quotation from one of them where he says exactly this. There is no single definitive stream of consciousness because there's no central headquarters, no Cartesian theatre where it all comes together for the perusal of a central meaner. Instead of such a single stream, however wide, there are multiple channels in which specialized circuits try, in parallel pandemoniums, to do their various things, creating multiple drafts. Okay, so this is a reference back to something you said earlier. Drafts of the self. So the brain creates a narrative about the self. Okay? So the brain is busy telling a story about its experiences. So it's not only having experiences, it's actually telling itself a story about what's going on. And this story has multiple drafts. You know, the brain keeps revising it. The multiple channels do their various things, creating multiple drafts of a narrative of the self as they go. Most of these fragmentary drafts of a narrative play short-lived roles in the modulation of current activity, but some get promoted to further functional roles in swift succession by the so we're back to the phi phenomenon, okay? By the activity of a virtual machine in the brain, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so what Dennett is saying is that the self is not an illusory object. It's not just a non-existent object. It's a fictional object, okay? It's a fictional object in a narrative that the brain tells itself about itself. So the brain kind of wants to make sense of what is going on in the various parts. So it formulates a narrative which includes the self. So the self is an object in the narrative the brain tells about itself. It's a fictional object. So, what does that do to the other objects of fiction? Well, look, we know there can be fictions within fictions. This is not uncommon in literature or drama. So in Shakespeare's play Hamlet, there's a famous scene where Hamlet arranges for a troupe of players to come in and enact a murder. He wants to see how he thinks the real murderer will react. So there's a play within a play in Hamlet. And in that play, the leader of the troupe actually plays someone who's murdered. That person is called Gonzago. So Gonzago is a fictional character. In fact, Gonzago is a fiction within a fiction, because already the play is a fiction in Hamlet. And Gonzago is a fictional character. So fictions within fictions are very well known, okay? So what we've just seen is that when a self appreciates a work of fiction, then the are not just fictions, they're fictions within a fiction. So the brain is creating a fiction. The fiction contains the self. and the self is reading this novel, and in this novel there are fictional objects. So these purely fictional objects are fictions within a fiction. So the bottom line of this talk is as follows. The self is a purely fictional object, which is such that in the fiction it can grasp other purely fictional objects, namely the objects that you and I read about in works of fiction. So, remember where I started? The question was, in fiction, you've got these two poles. The objects of the work of fiction and the self which appreciates these objects or understands these objects or grasps these objects. What I've been telling you is that the self is a purely fictional object in a narrative constructed by the brain, and at least purely fictional objects are also non-existent objects, as is the self. So the self is a non-existent object which features in a narrative told by the brain about what's going on, and in that fictional narrative that the brain tells itself, the self actually grasps other possibly non-existent objects. Okay, so you may not agree with me, you probably don't, but you're going to have your chance to say why in a minute. That's all I'm going to say for the moment. Thank you.